Our next speaker is Maria Urso from Smith & Nephew Biotherapeutics. For those of you standing in the back, there's a number of empty seats up in the front here. And with each of our speakers, as we go forward, there'll be a short period of time to ask one or two questions. But at the very end of the session, all of our speakers will be available in a panel-type discussion where you can come up and ask questions that you may have not been able to between or following each of their individual talks. So I invite you to stick around until the end if you have questions. All of our panelists will be available to answer them at that point. Dr. Urso.
Thank you very much. Thank you both so much for inviting me, and I'm thrilled to be here today because I have had probably one of the most non-traditional career paths over the past 15 years. So my assignment was to summarize my past 15 years in 15 minutes, and I'm going to attempt to do that without sounding like an auctioneer, so hang on tight, it's going to be a wild ride, all right? But we're going to cover everything. I'm putting my email up at the end, and please take it, and if you have any questions or want to do any of that awesome networking we've been talking about, please feel free to contact me. So I thought it was poor form to show up to a scientific meeting without graphs, so I'm going to use a lot of graphs and figures in my talk. And this is the basic layout of my talk today. And I'm going to first start with why would you even consider a non-traditional career path? Why would you do what everyone else is not doing? And the second is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what it looks like from my experiences and what I've had and what I've dealt with. And finally, what should you do en route? So right now, while you're in the moment, what can you be doing and what can you do over the next couple of years in order to secure that position that is meant for you? And that's going to change. So I'm going to tell you right now that never, when I was in your seat, did I think that I would be a captain in the military doing research, an active duty captain. But it happened just that way. So always keep an open mind. I've also divided up that most of this talk, 66% is going to be about you, but a little bit of it is going to be about me, just to give you a better idea. So why even consider a non-traditional career path? There's certain factors, and for those of you who are writing notes or taking notes, you could all take it away with you. You have your slides. Each of these are something you want to assess, and you want to assess them continuously. Today, a month from now, and even a year from now. They're going to change. It's a dynamic system depending on your life, where you end up, and what type of opportunities present themselves to you. They consist of things such as what tasks are appeals to you, what drives you, and something that you maybe never consider, but what are you physically capable of, and why is that important? So the reason why they're important is because they're going to consistently shape your career path. And it's not just something that you're doing right now while you have this perception of the years that lie ahead. Only you know who you are. You may have the best mentor or mentors in the world, and they can tell you things, and they can offer you guidance. They can tell you things that your next move is going to be career suicide, but you know that internally the decision that you're making is a decision for a reason. And so you always need to stand by your convictions. And by having this plan, which I think Dr. Clifford laid out very nicely, it's going to help you stick to that plan that you've laid before you. So the other thing that you need to do is which tasks appeal to you. And this is almost like a little bit of my quiz. Of course, we're going to go off of it. And I'm going to dive a little deeper into this over the course of the talk. But are you a yellow? Or are you more of a red? And red being that you focus on teaching, and teaching is something that appeals to you. Or are you made up of more blues and greens? You love to write. We're going to have a great talk today by a scientific writer and someone who does that from their position. Or is it that clinical aspect? Do you love taking the science, the high-level science that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, and making it more palatable, that it can be digested and used by a clinician or even by a patient, so more for the layperson? So which color are you, and how can you assess that? So which type of schedule do you prefer? That's something that's absolutely critical. Are you someone who knows that the only way that you can meet deadlines or you can get projects done is if you're surrounded by like-minded people with like-minded tasks? You like more of an 8 to 5 type schedule, you know that Saturdays are spent writing, or are you more of a person who likes that autonomy? That you have a deadline to meet by, say, April 15th, getting your taxes done, and you're going to do whatever you need to do, however you need to do it. For example, I'm home-based. There's days that I'm on the road, but then there's days I'm home. I live on the beach, so nobody knows if I'm out surfing at 9 o'clock in the morning, but my work always gets done, and I know that I have that discipline to get that done and how you can do it. It may mean that you're working at 9 o'clock at night, but if you have that discipline without someone reining you in, then that's a career that might be more suited for you. What are you physically capable of? Now, as I mentioned, I was an active duty captain in the Army, and that required a very high physical demand. I took that position after I finished my PhD. I did not do a postdoc, I joined the military. That's extremely non-traditional. And the reason why I did that is I was doing human-based research in skeletal muscle, and I wanted to continue to do human-based research. And I found that the military does a lot of human-based research that is funded, so it's very difficult now to obtain NIH funding for human-type performance or muscle resilience or understanding physiology at the human level. And one way I could do that was by being a 71 Bravo, which was a biochemist for the military, and so that's what I did. The other reason why I have what are you physically capable of, and I have a cute little picture of Flat Stanley up here, is in the past week as a medical science liaison, actually since Friday, I've been in 5 hotels, I've been in 3 different time zones, and I've had over 13 hours of flight delays because of the lovely northeast weather that we've had. And finally, what about your family? And what about everyone with you? I live in the Northeast, and we had a lovely winter last year in Boston. I think this is when we finally had 6 feet of accumulation. But are you going to pick a job because it matches everything written down on your piece of paper, and then you're going to get there, and you're going to be miserable, and you're just going to be frustrated with, shoveling all winter? Or is this something that is still going to work for you? And the reason why this is also important as a scientist, how many of you have research projects where you have to go in to deliver drugs to your mice every single day? You have to check on them post-surgery. You need to make sure your cells are viable. Most people are like, hooray, it's a snow day. I don't have to go into the office tomorrow. I went into panic mode. How am I going to rally my entire staff because we were supposed to have surgeries tomorrow? I need to make sure that my mice are okay, and I need to get my data points collected. So that's also something you need to consider. Is your research going to be viable in the environment you set yourself up in? What are your strengths and what's driving you? And I'm pretty sure looking out here that you're all brilliant scientists, you're all very successful in your field, and you're doing very well where you are, but I'm also sure that some of you are musicians, or you're artists, or you're athletes, and there's something else that defines you outside of the laboratory. And so if any of you were to follow your one passion, you might not even be at this conference. So you have to think about not only the passions that you have, but as we know, there's 90,000 or 60,000 successful of you that are going to be out there competing with you, and what's going to define you? What are your unique qualities that you have that's going to define you and set you apart from those other 59,999 people who are competing for similar jobs? And what does it look like? So I'm going to now focus a little bit on me and a little bit on what I did and different positions that I've held. So as I mentioned, the very first thing that I did not do a postdoc. I went to be a scientist. I was a research-based scientist. I had a very successful lab. That was a large product of my mentor while I was working on my PhD. And I'm going to talk about some of those things that she put into my toolbox during my PhD training that allowed me to successfully make that transition from PhD student to leader of a lab. But I was also in the military. And the way that it looked was I had a lot of research. Research was my main focus. That's how my days were to be spent. I was expected to publish 1 to 3 papers a year. I did teach a little bit, so you can see that's just this red piece of the pie. That was only about 10% of my time. I had soldiers who need to learn laboratory techniques, but also I wanted them to know why they were doing it. I wanted them to know why we were doing the type of research we were doing. A lot of people have this belief that if you work for the government or in a situation like that, you just get all the money you want and you could do all the research you want to and you don't have to write grants. That's not true. You need to create an argument why your work is important, and you need to get funded from within the government. They need to say, before I write this check to support your research, I need to know why it's important. So you do need to be proficient and successful and persuasive at grant writing. You do need to take a twist and make sure that you can make your research be relevant to that type of model that you're in. There's a lot of administrative work. I always hear like, oh my gosh, the government, you're going to be so bogged down. I will tell you, you can't use a thumb drive. You can't use a flash drive. That would think of taking your data from computer to computer, even getting a simple program to analyze your data. So those were some of the things that would eat up hours of your day that you wouldn't have in a different environment. From there, I moved to Director of Clinical Research in an industry position. I knew the tasks, again, that I excelled at, and I was one of those who I was very blue and green. I loved writing. I loved taking very high-level science and making it palatable, either from a speaking, a communication, an oral perspective, or to a written perspective. For both the layperson, I was talking to a lot of generals to tell them why my research was important for their troops, and the last time they might have seen science was in high school. And the other thing was having a clinical aspect, as I also like to make my research palatable from that point. That type of job, I did a lot of writing from your nice, boring FDA documents that had to fit a absolute, you don't go outside this rain. You have to make sure everything is done and checks out. But I also had to do a lot of writing for physicians. We call it ghostwriting. So you're writing those papers for them. And also doing a lot of policy. So if you're someone who is persuasive, I mentioned lobbying earlier, and I know another speaker is going to talk about this a bit, but if you're persuasive, if you could find a way to say, so insurance companies, are they going to insure a certain medication or a certain treatment? And you are working with lobbyists, and you need to have a good understanding of those workings. Right now, I'm a medical science liaison. So I went away from that aspect of director of clinical research, and my job is to communicate why a drug is important for a type of treatment. And from that, I'd say that I'm still in the blues and the greens. I'm doing a lot of writing. I'm doing a lot of teaching to our sales force. Now think about that type of teaching. So I, again, have to explain the mechanism of action of a drug to our entire sales force, who their strengths are communication, their strengths are business. And you have to be able to communicate your importance to your external stakeholders from a business perspective, but also your internal stakeholders. And that's a very dynamic type of way how you're showing your research. You're on call, the phone rings a lot. I have a lot of emergencies and a lot of fires to put out. You can have a doctor who has an off-label question and they're going to contact you, and you need to be able to answer them. Again, you're working on grants and funding. This time you're not writing it, your physicians are writing it, or different teams are writing it, and you have to make sure that that's not only good science, but it's shovel-ready. You're under a time course. You have maybe 6 months or 12 months. You have to make sure that their experimental design is almost bulletproof, that it's going to work, that their sample size is proper. So you're almost like a grant reviewer in that sense, but you're supporting them and guiding down as it's developed. So finally, let's talk about you. And these are some of the take-home notes I'm going to give you and what you should do to get there. Some of the things I want to highlight here is you absolutely have to learn how to write and communicate. And from that, you need to be able to spin it. If you're applying for any grants or any student grants, can you spin your research not only at the basic science level, but health related, or something that is much more marketable to a larger audience and not just someone who's interested in your field and exactly what you're doing. You need to volunteer for as many things as possible, sitting on committees, whether you start with district and then move out to regional and move out to the national level. You will have so many interactions and you'll have so many people who are in your network that no matter what you want to do, you can reach out to someone who has the skills that you may lack. A great example, I said I switched not only from human research but to animal research, but I didn't do a postdoc. And so I had someone who I had met at a conference who actually came to my lab and taught me how to do a technique in animals that turned out to be the basic pillar of my research that helped me publish several papers afterwards. And that was simply a consequence of networking. You want to present at every meeting just so that you could get out there and have exposure, and you want to be sure to get things done. Finally, increasing your marketability. Avoid the conference pod. Absolutely critical. Go walk around by yourself. Not only are you much more approachable, but if you get into a conversation with someone, you're not going to be looking over your shoulder at your friends saying 5 more minutes, 2 more minutes, I'm almost done. It's just you're going to have that conversation that's going to lead somewhere that is actually going to have an outcome to it. Establish consistent outlets for growth. Interns, we always think that once you're into the postdoc situation, you don't want to intern. I still volunteer. I have an established career and I still volunteer and consult on the side because it allows me to grow. And you step outside your comfort zone, you're always growing, and you might stumble across something that makes sense for you from a career perspective. And finally, is this the right path for you? And I think it sounds, right now, there's kind of like this trend to move over to industry. Everyone thinks you get paid all this money and it's so wonderful. But there's certain things that you have to think about. To go back to that first slide about sticking by your convictions, what drives you? If someone says this is the research you're going to do and this is the time that you need to complete it in, is that going to frustrate you? If you think the experimental design is rotten, are you going to have that ethical ability to continue to go forward with it and not speak up? If it is something that's good, though, and you're working with a big team, the absolute consequence that you're going to have from that is going to be wonderful. So you're going to have a product that's going to have an output more than you could even imagine working on your own in a lab. And you'll have to appreciate that with industry, there's always a profit margin. You could work on the most amazing study, you can get 2 years into it, and all of a sudden they could say, hey, guess what? Our bottom line no longer is supporting your research, you're all done. And oh, by the way, you need to find a new job in the next 3 months. And that's industry, and that's the way it works. And so are you going to be comfortable with that? And again, think about what are you physically capable of, and what is your family willing to take a risk on? And finally, have you done your research? I can't drive this last one home enough, is do not interview just to get a foot in the door. I think some people, and some of my colleagues, they're just taking any job interview that comes across. I cannot get across how small this community is. Everyone knows everyone else, and everyone talks to everyone else. If you leave a bad impression, or if you show up somewhere unprepared, or if it's not suited for you, it may get out there, and you may risk subsequent interviews. So unless you're truly passionate about something and it matches you, follow that. And the other thing is, if you walk in and you say, oh, well, that position might be good for me, and I also like to write, and maybe I can do this, it doesn't sound like you're focused. It sounds like you're willing to accept anything that's out there. So with that, I'm going to leave my email up there. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, or we're going to have a panel afterwards. So thank you.